Transmigration, Analysis of Trance. Thou shalt hold the opinion of Pythagoras, ere I will allow of thy wits, and fear to kill a woodcock, lest thou dispossess the soul of thy grandam. 12th Night. Through all thy veins shall run a cold and drowsy humour, which shall seize each vital spirit. Romeo and Juliet. Astra. You have granted me more than you desire, dear Evelyn. If life be restored, it had never deserted the body, and yet the mind had deserted it. The mind and body, then, are both independent of each other. From this truth, a metaphysical question of deep and wondrous interest arises. In what condition does the mind exist, during so long a period, uninfluencing and uninfluenced by the power of perception? I remember searching for some elucidation of this mystery among those ghost stories of the Hebrews, founded on the purgatory of souls, in Stehelin's Traditions of the Jews, but I rose from my reading unenlightened. Ida. And ever will, Astrophel. Profane curiosity must fail in such a study. Adoration alone can sanctify this mystic question, on which theologians and philosophers, even those devoutly confident in the sublime truths of immortality, have so essentially differed. Like Astrophel, Paley inquires where is the soul during suspended vitality? And Priestley, where when the body was created? Hume, with the subtlety of a skeptic, asks how can the soul long be the same, seeing that, like the body, its particles are constantly changing. While Glanville thinks himself a wondrous wight, as he prates of its essential spicitude, a something that is more subtle than body, contracting itself into a less ubi. Were this sublime secret fathomable by the deepest intellect, then would be unfolded things above, which are ordained to be ever mysteries to creatures on earth, such as the future existence of the spirit, and the nature of paradise. Although revelation has given us glimpses, enough to satisfy humble devotion, what mind can decide on the exact nature and changes of its own future state? The negative answer is at once returned by the variety of these learned opinions, that the soul is, immediately after death, submitted to its reward or punishment. That its state after death is one of half happiness or misery, until it be again joined to its body on the resurrection, and then it shall enjoy or suffer the extremes of felicity or torment. That the soul rests in quiet unconsciousness until the day of judgment, and lastly, that souls are purified by purgatory and comparative suffering, and then are admitted into the realms of perpetual enjoyment. Astra. Is it not strange that in this notion of purgatory, with slight variations, pagans, and Romanists, and Egyptians, and Brahmins, so nearly accord? In the creed of the Brahmins, there is something of sublimity, whatever may be their error, and Ida will not chide, if I repeat the essence of their creed, which Robertson has gathered from the Bhagavad Gita. Every intelligent nature, particularly the souls of men, they conceive to be portions separated from this great spirit, to which, after fulfilling their destiny on earth, and attaining a proper degree of purity, they would be again reunited. In order to efface the stains with which a soul, during its residence on earth, has been defiled by the indulgence of sensual and corrupt appetites, they taught that it must pass, in a long succession of transmigrations, through the bodies of different animals, until, by what it suffers and what it leaves in the various forms of its existence, it shall be so thoroughly refined from all pollution, as to be rendered meet for being absorbed into the divine essence. And returns, like a drop, into that unbounded ocean from which it originally issued. Aristotle, in taking up this notion of transmigration in his book De Anima, says that the soul was always joined to a body, sometimes to one, sometimes to another. And from this idea were taken the stories of Fadlala and the Dervis, in the Spectator, of the transmigrations of Indus, and the beautiful fable of Psyche, or the soul, which when a body died, could not live alone on earth, and so crept into another. Herodotus, in the second book of his history, has some allusions to the Egyptian creed, and, indeed, the fear of this transmigration was the origin of mummies among the Copts. Their belief that the soul, the immortality of which they very early, if not the first, decided, could not leave the body when entire, induced them to preserve that body as long as possible. And the mummy unrollers and hieroglyphic readers must commit sad sacrilege, by exposing their sacred dust to the decomposition of air. When the body was dissolved, however, the soul entered that of some animal that instant born. And profane commentators have, on this creed, presumed to explain the sacred story of the banishment in savage life of Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 30,000 years, it again entered that of a man. And it is likely that their object in embalming was, to have the soul re-enter the same body from choice and habit. Simonides, 400 years after the siege of Troy, ungallantly reversed this doctrine, deciding that the souls of women were formed of the principles and elements of brutes. The Pythagorean system was, if not more courteous, at least more just. Thus all things are but altered, nothing dies. And here and there embodied spirit flies. By time, or force, or sickness, dispossessed. And lodges, where it lights, in bird or beast. Or hunts without, till ready limbs it find. And actuates those according to their kind. From tenement to tenement is tossed. The soul is still the same, the figure only lost. This is from Dryden's translation of Chaucer. And Burton's record is as follows. The Pythagoreans defend metempsychosis and palingenesia, that souls go from one body to another, epita prius lethes nuda, as men into wolves, bears, dogs, hogs, as they were inclined in their lives. Or participated in conditions. Inc farinas. Possumus ire domus pecudumque in corpora cindi. Lucian's cock was first Euphorbus, a captain. Al ego, nam memoni, Trojani tempori belli. Panthoids Euphorbus eram. And Plato, in Timaeus, and in Phaedo. Ev. Enough of Plato, dear Astrophel. Or believe, with me, that his philosophy on this point was merely figurative of the similarity of mind, or genius, or feature, between the dead and the living. As it was said of old, that the soul of Raphael had transmigrated to the body of Francesco Mazzola, Parmigiano, because his style and personal beauty so closely resembled those of the all but divine master of his art. And pray what was the gist of that special astronomer, who affirmed that he saw something written in the moon? A wild romance only? No, forsooth. Pythagoras may classically vociferate. Erit, eti illinc. Huc venit, hinc illic, quaslabet occupat artis. Spiritus equi feris humana in corpora transit. Inc feras noster. But read further, and you will find the high moral to be a severe injunction against flesh-eating. Then let not piety be put to flight. To please the taste of glutton appetite. But suffer innate souls secure to dwell. Lest from their seats your parents you expel. With rabid hunger feed upon your kind. Or from a beast dislodge a brother's mind. Think you this injunction will be obeyed, in the face of the Almanac de Germans? Ida. Evelyn is severe. May I tell him that, among the records of the East, he will find incidents blended with this idea which may almost consecrate the creed of a pagan. As the honey is hung close to the poison sting of the bee, there may be a bright spot to illuminate the gloomy annals of superstition. The very belief in transmigration may impart an atom of mercy, even to an infidel. And where superstition, shorn of the light of Christianity, must prevail, it were better sure to foster that notion which may, even in one little sentiment, half humanize the heart. Listen to this contrast, between some Orient sects, along the eastern shores of Hindostan. The daughters of Gujarat fold their infants to their bosoms drugged with opium. And when the babe is thus poisoned, the Hindu girl will answer with a languid and seeming innocent smile, "It is not difficult to blast a flower bud." Then the Kurata Brahmins, as we read in the Rudaradaya, believing themselves the agents of Vishara Bhut, the spirit of poison, sacrifice the pundits to their vampire goddess, Mahalakshmi. Equally blind, yet more happy in the nature of their superstition, are the Shravak Banyans, or the proselytes of Jena. The yadi, or officiating priest of this order, in purifying the temples, sweeps the floor with the Rajuhuran, a broom of cotton threads, lest hapless one little insect may be destroyed. And this we may believe, from the creed of transmigration being influential among these people. Sir Paul Ricotte also, in his Oriental History, informs us of parallel incidents among the devout Mohammedans, who, believing that in the body of a brute may reside the soul of a departed relative, ransom, with their gold, many a bird that would otherwise flutter away its captivity in a cage. Cast. I will not flout your praises, Ida, but, in our own island, this illusion has rather led to captivity. I remember the story of a lady, living in Worcestershire, who, under the innocent delusion that her daughters were changed into singing birds, hung her pew in the cathedral with cages of goldfinches and linnets. And Lord Orford, in his Reminiscences, thus records the monomania of the Duchess of Kendal. In a tender mood, he, King George, promised the Duchess that if she survived him, and it were possible for the departed to return to this world, he would make her a visit. The Duchess, on his death, so much expected the accomplishment of that engagement, that a large raven, or some black fowl, flying into one of the windows of her villa, at Isleworth, she was persuaded it was the soul of her departed monarch so accoutred, and received and treated it with all the respect and tenderness of duty, till the royal bird, or she, took the last flight. Astra. You spoke of the absolute senselessness of trance, and yet there were some hints of the awakening power of fear. Is this consistent? Ev. I expected your objection. In the cases of perfect catalepsy, the brain is not conscious of its mind, or if the mind be active, there is no assurance of its activity. But, as its faculties are awakened, it usually begins to work exactly where it left off. One of the most imposing proofs, both of a separate existence during life, and of our body's unconsciousness of this transient disunion. Astra. I may own, Evelyn, that your illustrations of our questions, in despite of some straining at explanation, carry, on many points, conviction to my own mind, but not on all. There is another question equally interesting with the former. How is vitality preserved during this protracted abstinence? Ev. Remember, dear Astrophel, my confession, that there are inexplicable mysteries. But, to the point of your last question. We are aware of the long period during which the body may fast after shipwreck, or beneath a fallen cliff, or even on the incarceration of animals for the purpose of experiment. Thus Captain Bligh, and 17 persons, sailed 4,000 miles in an open boat, with a small bird occasionally for the food of all. The Juno's crew, wrecked off Arakan, existed 23 days without food. And the wreck of the Medusa is fresh in our memories. Here the body feeds on its own fat, shrinking until that supply is lost, and then it dies. I might relate to you the very impressive stories of and more, of Tutbury. Of Janet MacLeod, told by Dr. Mackenzie, and many strange facts related by Dr. Willan, Sir William Hamilton, and others. I might refer you to legends, of which I can scarcely press for your belief. As the strange but authenticated story of Anna Garbero, of Raconigi, 40 miles from Turin, who existed without nutrition for 2 years, becoming like a shriveled mummy. And that of Eve Hergen, who existed 13 years upon the odor of flowers. But even with that incredulous frown of Astrophels, and that faint smile of thine, fair Castaly, let me at once to my explanations. In natural sleep the functions of the body are impeded. One of these is digestion. As there is little waste of the system there is little necessity for repletion, and life can be supported by a very slight action of the heart, a minute current of blood. Like the slender vitality of infants, who, even in a state of health, seem frequently scarcely to breathe. The circulation is materially influenced in sleep, the pulse being slower and more feeble than during waking. The relaxation of the cutaneous vessels inducing frequent perspiration, especially in debilitated systems, and in the last stages of adynamic fevers. The body of the cataleptic patient descends to the condition of less complex animal life, in which there appears a much greater simplicity of organization. And we well know, as we descend in the scale of creation, towards the cold-blooded single-hearted animals, and especially if we reach the zoophyte, in how exact a proportion to this simplicity of structure is the tenacity of life increased. Fish, says Sir John Franklin, were taken out of the nets frozen, and became a solid mass of ice, being by a blow of a hatchet easily split open. They, however, recovered their vitality on being thawed. A course of systematic abstinence will enable us, if we wished it, to endure extreme privations, which a high feeder would soon sink under. And this is probably the discipline adopted by the fakirs of India, who fast so long under the influence of superstitious devotion. Valiant Spider lived without food nearly 1 year, John Hunter's toad 14 months. Land tortoises 18 months, a beetle 3 years, and 2 serpents, according to Shaw, 5 years, an antelope has survived 20 days without food, some dogs 40 days, an eagle 23 days. Now all animals fall asleep at certain temperatures, which they cannot resist, but the common effect of extreme cold is death. Dar. Solander was yielding to the influence of intense cold in Terra del Fuego, but was saved by the firmness of Sir Joseph Banks. Richmond, the Black, lay down on the snow to sleep, and died. There is a close analogy between this state and the hibernation of animals, although the causes are not similar. Animalculae often become torpid for lack of moisture, and, even after the lapse of 27 years, have been revivified by water. The small Furcularia anastobia will repeatedly become animated and lively by a single drop of water, its previous condition being completely quiescent. The snail, the alligator, indeed most of the Ophidian and Saurian reptiles, assume the torpid state in a period of extreme drought, and Humboldt states this also of the Centine solosus, a Madagascar hedgehog. This hibernation of animals, as of the marmot and the dormouse, resembles the deep sleep arising from cold of a certain degree, for if this be intense, they will sometimes be momentarily roused from it. They may be constantly kept awake by heat and powerful light. Thus hibernation and the sleep of plants take place from the withdrawal of stimuli, heat being the animal, light the vegetable stimulus. Cast. The sleep of plants. A fiction surely. Ev. Nay, a truth. The irritability of plants is excited by their peculiar stimulus, when this is withdrawn, they fall to sleep. Most of the discus flowers turn to the sun in his course, as the sunflower, the helianthus, and the croton. The acacia leaves at noon point towards the zenith. The tamarind, the oxalis, and the trefoil, fold their leaves on the exclusion of light. The evening primrose shuts its blossom at sunset, while that minion of the moon, the night-blowing cactus, then only begins to bloom, perhaps like the owl, and goatsucker, and bat, who find the sun too powerful an excitant. Vegetables may be put asleep by the withdrawal of proper stimulus, the exclusion of this light. But this is a law of nature, and ordained for a special purpose. It is chiefly during fructification. The leaves at night folding round the flowers and seed vessels, to protect them from the chilling blight of the night cold, which would congeal their juices. In this condition of the plant its irritability ceases, but the circulation of its sap vessels is not suspended. Its vitality continues, but if the exercise of its peculiar phenomena be long discontinued, it will fade and die. Now the vis insita of the muscle resembles vegetable irritability, and, as this is lost and sensibility suspended, the body is indeed in a condition of vegetable sleep. For vegetables have not of course sensation, although the Darwinian romance would endow the Dionea, the Hetesarum, and the mimosa with sensibility, and all the blossom beauties of flora with the fervor of sexual passion. Trance then is caused by the removal of a stimulus. As somnambulism may result from a redundancy of nervous energy, trance and catalepsy, as well as incubus, seem to arise from an inefficient secretion or supply of this quality, in whatever it may consist. Or an impediment to its transmission from the sensorium or brain to the expansion of a nerve. Thus the motive power of a muscle is in these diseases suspended, which in paralysis may be permanently impaired or destroyed. To describe this state, I must abound in negatives. The brain is not conscious, there is no sensation. Even the marrow by its reflex faculty does not excite a muscle, there is no action, the mind has no cognizance, the body is for a time paralyzed. What is there then which may be termed life? Merely involuntary circulation and gentle breathing. In this condition also there is a congestion of dark blood about the brain and in the right side of the heart, the circulation being reduced to an extreme lenteur or sluggishness, while in real asphyxia there is a total stagnation. I have done with minute pathology, as there are however two diseases, epilepsy and insanity, which may be the result of catalepsy. I may offer a precept on the point. The propensity to trance cannot suddenly be averted, but the state of the body and mind are important studies for our treatment. Melancholy and apathy are the features of the mind of the cataleptic, and languor and faulty secretions the symptoms of the body. Cheerful society, sympathy with suffering, but firmness in resisting sloth and erroneous fancies, and the direction of the patient's mind to moral recreations, comprehend the sum of our mental treatment. It is equally essential to ensure regulation of the secretions, especially those of the liver. We should employ cupping from the nape of the neck, if there be pain, or heat, or fullness of the head, and constant but gentle exercise. The head should not be low during sleep, nor should food be taken within 2 hours of retiring to rest. I believe obedience to these slight precepts will frequently mitigate, perhaps in the end avert the attacks, especially if they have arisen from diseased conditions of the body, or gloomy or depraved studies, and deep contemplation. The most simple or unconnected form of catalepsy, is that most likely to end in madness. Perhaps, too, in deep and gloomy subjects, which begin by absorbing mind and sense, the end is thus. So that cataleptic abstraction is but the reverie or foretaste of mania. As to suspected cases of still existing vitality, where there is plethora, I would employ bleeding, or cupping, insufflation, galvanism. And I should not in extreme cases fear acupuncture of the heart, and galvanic shocks then transmitted through the needle. Beclard, in La Pity, in Paris, allows the needle to remain 3 or 4 minutes and then withdraws it, and I have learned from my Oriental friends, that the Chinese practice this mode extensively. Mesmerism. Thus smiling, as some fly had tickled slumber. Not as death's dart, being laughed at. Sibylline. By some illusion see thou bring her here. I'll charm his eyes against she doth appear. Such tricks hath strong imagination. Midsummer Night's Dream. Ida. You are very formidable creatures, Evelyn, if you can touch and wound the heart of a sensitive girl so easily. We must be wary, dear Castaly. It must be a desperate case that justifies so desperate a remedy. Yet, with all this danger, the magi of our day will, as I have heard, induce by their art this very state of trance. Astra. Magnetic sleep. If the phenomena of this animal magnetism be not a mystery, it is at least a curiosity. And yet Evelyn will tell us that they, too, obey the common laws of our nature. I believe, however, there are stories of most strange and novel interest, beyond the scope even of his philosophy. Ev. The hand of a magnetizer seems, I confess, to effect a wonder, but your challenge will be fatal to you, Astrophel. In this same question of animal magnetism we may discover the spring of all your mysteries. The close analogies between the natural and imparted phenomena of trance and magnetic sleep and somnambulism, and somnambulic blindness, and magnetic ecstasy. Even the frauds of lucid vision and clairvoyance, and the vaunted gift of prophetic divination, with the explanation of some, and the refutation of others, will dispel the most subtle arguments in proof of divine influence. Seeing that the process is conducted by men of mortal mold, who claim no merit even for the possession of occult learning. Cast. Mercy, dearest Evelyn, mercy. No more philosophy tonight. The smile of yon planet Venus, that was twinkling from out its cerulean blue, is veiled in a cloud, for our cold discourse is treason to its influence. Be ready with your stories, Astrophel. Ev. The history of mesmerism is a romance in itself, dear Castaly. If I invade not the province of Astrophel, I will, as some apology for my dull prosing, sketch its progress by way of episode. You must know, then, that it was Maximilian Hall who first, from the influence of his magnets on the body, imparted the practical idea of animal magnetism to Mesmer, who had already written his inaugural thesis, at Vienna, on planetary influence. and had laid down this unblushing aphorism: there is one health, one disease, one remedy, and one physician, and that physician am I. His immediate proselytes were Deslon at Paris, and Gmelin at Heilbronn, and Reich at Stuttgart, and Kluge at Berlin. Encouraged by the Swedenborgian tenets, this magic brought immense revenue into the purses of Mainanduc in England, and the rest of its revivers. So that 100 guineas were given for a course of lectures and experiments, and 15 guineas for a consultation and the imparting of its influence. In after times Miss Prescott, among others, gained great fame in the art, but de Lauterbourg was one of its most popular professors. 3,000 patients, it is said, were often waiting for the magnetic influence about his house at Hammersmith. In 1784 an ordonnance of the French king confirmed Mesmer in his working of these apparent miracles. By tractions on the body, either with the hand or by substances magnetized with his imponderable fluid, by shampooing, and the accompaniment of sweet music, a state of enchantment of the senses was induced. Convulsions and mania were often excited in the Hall of Crisis, which was lined by soft cushions to protect the convulsionaries. These paroxysms and tempests of the brain Mesmer seemed to control, like a second Prospero, with his wand of enchantment, gliding, in robes of silk, among the multitude of devotees, whom novelty and voluptuousness had attracted to his shrine. To study and report on these mysteries, commissioners were appointed by the Faculty of Medicine, by the Academy of Sciences, and by the Royal Society of Medicine. These savans referred all to the influence of imagination, or of emotion in sensitive systems. And that there must be this sensitive predisposition is often proved, for idiots, and those who have been blindfold, and unconscious children, remain uninfluenced, although it is declared by one that he magnetized an idiot baby. I must observe, that before the commissions in Paris, especially that of which Franklin was a member, not the slightest influence was observed. And the experiments of M. Berner, who was the chief manipulator, were a perfect failure, especially in regard to the clairvoyance. Astrophel reminds me by his frown. Astre. That magnetic power is not granted to all. That all possess not the essential qualities of mind and body. It was affirmed that the operator must have his mind abstracted, and teeming with affection and benevolence towards his patients. Must believe himself a very magnet, and feel a desire of benefiting mankind. Thus a sympathy, or incorporation of atmospheres, was induced, by which disease was influenced. And even in persons distant from each other, by an intensity of thought the patient tasted, smelt, or heard, the flavors, odors, or sounds which at that moment affected the senses of the operator. The magnetizer must thus be confident that, by his will, he can pass his whole nervous energy into his patient. It is essential, also, that the mind of the patient should have a corresponding willingness to be magnetized. Ev. And this congenial platonism is sometimes so intense, that offers of magnetic marriage are made by the ecstatic ladies to their magnetizers, even though it may not be leap year, on the plea that the loneliness of magnetic widowhood distressed them. And that the possession of a sleeping partner was better than sleeping alone. Under this interesting disposition for magnetic union, the eyes of the maiden being fixed on the magnetizer intensely, his hands were passed before her body, his fingers thus forming natural conductors, by which the magnetic fluid was conveyed from the positive to the negative magnetic body. Then came the wonders of this influence. The patient was warmed by the benevolence of the magnetizer, who felt an aura or tingling in the part corresponding to any painful part of the patient's body which was relieved or cured. Indeed, Bertrand assures us that many told him they saw a blue fluid streaming from his fingers when he magnetized them. The secret of this is closely analogous to the effect of brooding over sorrow. The mind of the patient is concentrated on the spot to which the passes are directed. And, as we know that disease can be excited thus by imagination, especially in the hypochondriac, so it is a truth that this concentration may remove disease and pain, especially by the superaddition of faith. Astre. But the magnetizer, as they said, was not always in a state to operate and required a certain training. So it was observed that Caspar Hauser's cat did not follow him after he had eaten meat. His magnetic and somnambulant qualities were destroyed by animal food, although they were so abundant in his wilder state, as his history will thus illustrate to those who believe it. As I came into the room, and the door of the deceased person was opened, which I did not know, I felt a sudden dragging on both sides of my breast, as if any one wished to pull me into the room. As I went on and proceeded towards the sick person, a very strong breath blew on me from behind, and the pulling which I felt before in my breast I now felt in my shoulders. I went towards the window, the sick person followed me. At the time that I wished to ask a question of Mr. Von Gutter, I felt a trembling in my left foot, and it became unwell. She went back again, and that trembling left me. She seated herself under the canopy and said, "Will not the gentleman sit down?" Hereupon Mr. Professor Hensler said to her, she should see me. So as she drew nigh to me, within 2 or 3 steps, I was still more unwell than before, and I felt pains in all my limbs. Mr. Professor Hensler told her that I was the man who had been wounded, that is, by the attempt which had been made to assassinate him. At the same time she noticed my scar, and pointed towards it. Then came the air strong upon my forehead, and I felt pain in it, also my left foot began to tremble greatly. The sick person seated herself under the canopy, and said that she was ill, and I also said that I was so unwell that I must sit down. I sat down in the other room. Now the other foot began to twitter. Although Mr. Von Gutter held my knees, I could not keep them still. Now a violent beating of my heart came on me, and there was a heat in all my body. That beating of the heart left me afterwards, and I had a twittering in my left arm, which ceased after some minutes, and I was again something better. This condition lasted until the next morning, then I had a headache again and a twittering in all my limbs, still not so violent. In the afternoon, about 3 o'clock, it came again something less, and left me earlier, then I was quite well again. The somnambulist was greatly affected by the presence of Hauser. I heard that, afterwards, when she was asleep, she had said these words, "That was a hard struggle for me." She felt indisposition from this process even on the next day. F. The first sensation from magnetism is usually that of slight vertigo, a state of musing or reverie succeeding, the mind being lulled into abstraction, as it is by the rippling of water, the busy hum of bees, or the murmuring of the Aeolian harp. I would explain this feeling by the term, confusion of the senses, for a certain period must elapse ere an external object make an impression on the mind. When, therefore, objects or sounds become extremely rapid, the perception is confused, and the mind, left as it were to itself, cannot follow the impressions so as to associate them, and thus the magnetic ecstasy ensues. Astre. But M. de Peysegur, who first excited magnetic somnambulism, magnetized trees and ropes, by which he converted those who clung to them into sleepwalkers. Dr. Eliotson, also, mesmerized a sovereign, by merely looking on it. And a girl, who intuitively selected it from a heap of others, was instantly struck with coma. F. The last is a very frail experiment. Peysegur often failed in his illustrations, and then the cunning juggler explained this, by affirming that the trees countermagnetized each other. Now, whatever may be the influence imparted by this traction, the phenomena of excited somnambulism are similar precisely to those spontaneously occurring. Magnetic sleep, or ecstasis, is its precursor. And there is a total unconsciousness of it when awake. Here is one of those close analogies that are the most potent arguments on which the question of magnetism rests. For, in all the states alluded to, the interval of ecstasy is a blank. And, as in the cases of intense alarm, as you remember, the mesmeric ecstasy will cause a sensitive girl to forget the present, while the scenes of youth and infancy pass vividly before her memory. Now the effects of the passes of magnetism are referred to 6 degrees, the chief conditions being those of sleep, somnambulism, and clairvoyance. The essence of the last, it seems, is combined with a blending of one's own feeling and nature with those of others. A reuniting, in fact, of body and soul once separated from that individual whole, which some philosophers, as Hecker, believed the whole human race to be. You observe my fidelity, Astrophel. It must be confessed, that some of the experiments at which I have myself assisted exhibit very strange results. In some, there is the propensity to chatter nonsense, a system of one form of hysteria, of which the analogy is perfect. One little jade created much amusement, by inserting supernumerary syllables, thus, operwatiniwatsti. The insensibility of the nostril to the most powerful ammonia is a very imposing fact. One which must strike us more than that of insensibility of the eye to light, or the ear to sounds. For the faculty of perception may be often suspended in either of those organs of sense, if attention be powerfully diverted to another point, or, as it is by the abstraction of magnetic ecstasy, not directed to any. So that I do not wonder when thoughtless proselytes believe these effects to be miraculous, or credit the assertions of Perrault, in his Antidaemon of Mascon, that, the devil causeth witches to fall into ecstasies. So that a man would say their souls were out of their body. Or those of Bodin, in his Theatre of Universal Nature, that those that are rapt of the devil feel neither stripes nor cuttings. So that the honor of the magnetic monomania must at last be conceded to the fallen angel. Ida. And are all these wonders worked only to excite curiosity? Astur. I believe there is some good in it. Is it not certain, that during this state of magnetic sleep, operations have been performed without creating pain? The lady on whom Mons. Chapelain operated, talked coolly and unconsciously during its performance. And Jules Cloquet, in Paris, amputated the breast of a lady who had been put into an ecstasy or state of apathetic trance by a mesmerizer. Ev. It is, I believe, quite true that she was perfectly unconscious of the operation. But even this is not safe. Pain is given us as a warning against extreme injury, that by our complaint or suffering, the surgeon's mind may be on its guard. For the body is so far in disorder when it is chilled by this apathetic spell, that it may sink under fatal injuries, although they may be endured by the mind unconscious of its peril or its state. As a very curious antitype to these cases, it is stated in a medical gazette, that a young lady fell down in an hysterical fit and was insensible for 2 days. As a puffy swelling arose, she was trephined, but there was no disease of the brain. In 2 days after this, she awoke and expressed all the steps of the operation, of which she had been painlessly sensible. Astur. And in this state of ecstasis, is there not strange havoc played with the senses, by their seeming displacement or transference? The philosophers will tell us that the ganglia in the abdomen become as it were little brains, and the plexuses and the nerves of the skin become, like those of the senses, capable of imparting the idea of visible objects to those ganglia and of rendering a slight whisper distinctly audible. This is all very fine, and very material, but this straining at explanation is itself a proof of mystery. Van Guest records the case of Mademoiselle B., a young lady who was magnetized. She assured him that while she was intently looked upon, she felt her eyes and brain leave her head, and become fixed in her stomach. In which situation she saw acutely. But if she was in the slightest degree disturbed, the eyes and their sense seemed to return to her head. The stories recorded in the book of the Reverend Chauncey Townsend are not less curious than this. Ev. Although I take the metaphysics of a divine with reservation, his facts may not be doubted. For there are other powerful impressions that will produce phenomena as curious. The arm of a young man in the Ospedale della Vita, at Bologna, in 1832, was grasped by a convulsive patient. Violent spasms succeeded, and he lost the senses of taste, smell, and sensibility of the skin, but he could hear if the voice was applied on the stomach, and could, at that spot, discriminate between different substances. Another patient in the same hospital was subject every 3rd day to violent convulsions, during the continuance of which, he lost entirely the use of all his senses, and could neither hear, see, nor smell. His hands also became so firmly clenched, that it would be impossible to open them without breaking the fingers. Nevertheless, Dr. Siri, the physician under whose charge he was placed, discovered that the epigastric region, at about 2 fingers' breadth above the navel, received all the impressions of the senses, so as to replace them completely. If the patient was spoken to whilst the finger was placed on this spot, he gave answers, and even, when desired, opened his hands of his own accord. If any substance or matter was placed there, he could describe its form and quality, its color and smell. As long as the finger was kept on the stomach, the convulsion gradually diminished until it entirely disappeared. But if the finger were placed on the heart, the convulsion returned with increased violence, and continued as long as the finger was kept in that position. If a flute was played while the finger was kept on the stomach, the patient heard the music. But if the finger was taken away, and placed on the heart, and then taken back again to its former position, the man asked why they played by intervals, yet the flute had never ceased. These experiments were all made in the presence of the professors and students of the hospital. I will not counsel you, Astrophel, as to the extent of your belief in these strange tales, but extreme exaggeration often lessens the interest which scientific minds would take in these curiosities. These pictures are correct in their outline, but the artists have not spared their colors. They will remind us, who are learned in legends, of that elusive monomania among the monks of Mount Athos, who believed that they could at pleasure attain a celestial vision by communing devoutly with the deity, while their attention or their sight were directed to the umbilicus. And they were therefore called omphilopsychians. We discover also very close analogies to this mental concentration, in the acuteness with which one sense is endowed on the failure of another. The delicacy of touch in the blind is often extreme. I knew a blind lady who played an excellent rubber, passing her finger lightly over the card spots, and more curious still are the cases of Miss Mavoy, of Stanley the organist, and of Professor Saunderson. Deluc tells us of a lady, who read distinctly by passing her fingers over the page, even of a strange book. In Laura Bridgman, an American girl, an inmate of the institution of Boston since 1837, the whole faculty of perception was concentrated in the one sense of touch. At the age of 2, sight, and hearing, and smelling, and almost taste, deserted her. To this interesting creature, through the acuteness of her sense of touch in tracing letters, has been imparted so much knowledge, that the moral sentiments and the congenial affections of the heart are now beautifully displayed in her character. If by the dumb alphabet, or finger-talking, conversation is commenced with her, she follows the fingers with her arm with extreme rapidity, so that scarce a letter escapes her. Such are the wonders of this child's intelligence, that her mind has been cited as illustrative of innate sentiment, but the very facility is enough to explain her actions. Leucat writes of a blind sculptor at Volterra, who modeled features most faithfully by the touch. A French gentleman lost the integrity of every sense, but sensation remained in half of his face, on which he received the correspondence of his friends by their tracing on it letters or forms. In Mr. Eschke's establishment at Berlin, conversation was carried on by tracing letters on the clothes of the back. A Bolognese, on witnessing a woman in acute hysteria, became occasionally convulsed and impenetrably deaf. If, however, the slightest whisper was breathed to the pit of the stomach, he heard distinctly. From Andrel's lectures, to please you, Astrophel, I will select this fragment. I saw yesterday a young lady who has been frequently magnetized, and who, on my visit, presented some very remarkable circumstances. After a fit of indigestion she fell into the ecstatic state, in which she continued when I saw her. Her skin was perfectly insensible, and her eyes were open like animals in whom the fifth pair of nerves has been divided. She could perceive light, knew the difference between day and night for instance, but she could see and distinguish nothing else. She could not speak, but by signs expressed that her intellect was unusually active. But the most remarkable of the phenomena she presented was a singular exaltation of the sense of hearing. So extraordinarily delicate had this become, that she distinctly perceived sounds inaudible to myself and several other persons. Carus, unmindful of the existence of a state of abstract reverie resembling sleep, records the case of a young ecclesiastic, who composed sermons in a state of slumber, correcting and adding to them with peculiar care. And this is the deduction, that the sense of vision seemed to be transferred to the fingers, as the eyes were perfectly blinded to the writing paper. His eyes, when he sat for his portrait, should have been painted at the tips of his fingers. James Mitchell, congenitally deaf and blind, discriminated his friends from strangers, and even formed a fair estimate of character, by the smell of the parties. And there was a deaf woman, writes Lecat, who could read, and even tell the difference of languages, from the silent motion of the lip. From these very curious illustrations we may confess that these lines in Hudibras are no fiction. Communities of senses. To chop and change intelligences. As Rosicrucian virtuoses. Can see with ears and hear with noses. For so strange are the synonyms of the senses, that the blind will express their notion of color by sound. The tint of scarlet is like the sound of a trumpet. From this hint, probably, St. Amand, in the Pilgrims of the Rhine, speaks of a visible music. Ida. Do we not perceive, also, something of this acuteness in the sense of touch under certain other conditions? In the story of Caspar Hauser, whether it be romance or reality, we read the following illustration of the effect of mineral traction. Once, when the physician, Dr. Osterhausen, and the royal crown fiscal, Brunner, from Munich, happened to be present, Daumer led Caspar, in order to try him, to a table covered with an oil cloth, upon which lay a sheet of paper, and desired him to say whether any metal was under it. He moved his finger over it, and then said, "There it draws." "But this time," replied Daumer, "you are nevertheless mistaken, for, withdrawing the paper, nothing lies under it." Caspar seemed at first to be somewhat embarrassed, but he put his finger again to the place where he thought he had felt the drawing, and assured them repeatedly that he there felt a drawing. The oil cloth was then removed, a stricter search was made, and a needle was actually found there. Caspar Hauser might have felt this, or a cunning youth might have palmed on us his idea for a truth. Yet I confess Parkinson also relates the case of a woman who fainted on the touch of a stethoscope, exclaiming that it was drawing her too strongly. Cast. And of clairvoyance. Have you no incidents, Astrophel? Astra. Many. Listen to the following fragments. One from Andrel's lectures. M. Ferris was present at the experiment. A watch was held behind the individual's head. "I see," said he, "something that shines." "What is it?" "A watch." He was asked the hour, and replied exactly. 2 different watches were tried. He was equally precise. The watches were taken out of the room, and the hands altered. He still told the hours and minutes expressed on the dials. Another from an English newspaper, in 1833. Mr. Barnaby, 'twas at Bow Street, took his watch from his pocket, and said, "What have I got in my hand?" "A watch," was the reply. "What is it made of?" "Gold." "What chain is attached to it?" "None at all," said the boy, "there is a ribbon to it." "Can you tell at what hour the hand stands?" "Yes, at 12. Mr. B. showed his watch, and the hands were at 12 precisely. Mr. B. then produced his purse from his pocket, and asked the boy the color of it, and what it contained, and his answers were, without having the least opportunity of turning round towards the bench, that one end of the purse was brown, and the other yellow, and that the brown end contained sovereigns, and the yellow end silver. Mr. B. admitted the correctness of the description, and, taking some silver from his pocket, asked the boy to describe the different pieces. "What is this?" "Sixpence," said the boy, and of the date 1819. "What is the next?" "A shilling, and dated 1816, was the reply. And when the clerk brought forth another coin, and asked similar questions, the boy said, "That is a sixpence of the date of 1817, and all these guesses proved to be correct. Townsend and Wood, at Antwerp and Paris, produced this second sight in several instances. E. A., with eyes bandaged, read 200 pages of print, and even written music. Ev. A little more sifting of these cases, Astrophel, and they would resemble that of the cataleptic female of Amiens, related by Peetlin, who also professed to tell the spots of a card, unseen by her. But it was discovered that the physician glided it beneath the bedclothes. Or that told by Bertrand, of another ecstatic female, while lying entranced in a chamber illuminated by a candle, her ring was removed from her finger by Monsieur Bertrand, and given to a person standing near him. She was asked who had her ring. Mr. Eyre has it in his trousers pocket. Mr. Bertrand exclaimed that she was wrong, for it was not to Mr. Eyre the ring was given. The lady persisted in her statement, and, on immediate inquiry, it was found that the person who first was given the ring had secretly conveyed it to Mr. Eyre. The pages of history are not deficient in these pretensions to miracle. From Ulrich Zwingli we learn that Thomas Aquinas, the evangelical doctor, professed, by intense thought, to throw himself into ecstasy, in which, strange visions and mysteries of another existence passed before him. Matthew Paris writes of a monk of Evesham, and of a certain Sir Owen, that, in one of these ecstasies, was favoured with an introduction into St. Patrick's Purgatory. So the mad visionary, Jacob Boehme, fell into many strange trances, and at last were revealed to him, the origin of nature, the formation of all things, and even divine principles and intelligent natures. But the case of Santa Teresa, if we can but believe the testimony of so accomplished an hypocrite, presents phenomena far more remarkable than all these. Her frame was naturally delicate, her imagination lively, and her mind, incapable of being fixed by trivial objects, turned with avidity to those which religion offered, the moment they were presented to her view. But, unfortunately, meeting with the writings of Saint Jerome, she became enamored of the monastic life, and, quitting the line for which nature designed her, she renounced the most endearing ties, and bound herself by the irrevocable vow. Deep melancholy then seized on her, and increased to such a degree, that for many days she lay both motionless and senseless, like one who is in a trance. Her tender frame, thus shaken, prepared her for ecstasies and visions, such as it might appear invidious to repeat, were they not related by herself and by her greatest admirers. She tells us that, in the fervor of her devotion, she not only became insensible to everything around her, but that her body was often lifted up from the earth, although she endeavored to resist the motion. And Bishop Jessen relates in particular, that, when she was going to receive the Eucharist at Avila, she was raised in a rapture higher than the grate, through which, as is usual in nunneries, it was presented to her. She often heard the voice of God, when she was recovered from a trance, but sometimes the devil, by imitation, endeavored to deceive her, yet she was always able to detect the fraud. So that Teresa's life was an Elysium on earth, and she might well have cried out in her ecstasy, Sic sine vita. Vivere quam suave est, sic sine mort mori. Yet the modern proselytes to mesmerism would scarcely believe this a fiction, but an illustration of that lucid vision which may, it is believed, be so highly excited as to associate the being with universal nature, a creed grounded on the expansion or illimitable nature of thought or mind, by which it seems to leave the body, carrying with it its consciousness. So the disciples of Mesmer asserted, that, when they thought or spoke warmly of absent persons, they would both appear in their eidolon, and also that they were, at that exact time, speaking or thinking of them. This was Shelley's conviction, that mind sympathetically imparted ideas and thoughts, particles, indeed, of the mens divinior, so that they might well see in the dark. Browne would be in a flood of joy to hear the affirmations of these ecstatics, whose spirits, as they believe and avow, are for the time released from the chains of mortality. "Why," exclaimed one of these half-spiritualized creatures, "why do you bring me again to life? Would you depart from me, my body would grow cold, my soul would not return to it, and I should be happy." Astre. You are fond of caricature, Evelyn. I speak of sober truths only. I am told that the powers of acquirement may be so increased by magnetism, as to resemble new faculties. A lady, during a sort of ecstasy, sung most scientifically church music. Although, when awake, she entirely failed, and had forgotten all. And others will speak languages and sentiments, of which they are perfectly unconscious when awake. There was a girl in the vicinity of Bedford Row, of whose case there are related similar wonders of this magnetically imparted accomplishment, and her beauty was so enchanting, as to transcend the brightest visions of Michelangelo or Correggio. Ev. Like that of the inspired somnambule, of whom Wolfart thus writes in his Annals, an evil spirit ushered in her somnambulic sleep, and then a good spirit spread its wings around her. And when they had conversed, he flew with her to the eternal city, through the sun and the moon. And while there, tranced scenes were around her, and her spirit was enjoying her beatitude, her face was like the face of a seraph, and no mortal painter might essay to trace its beauty. So say those who saw this mystery. Astra. Yet, as to the prophetic power imparted by magnetism, cases are recorded by our enthusiastic proselytes, which throw the spells of the conjurer into an eclipse. Ev. And therefore forbid belief. Astra. Even those displayed before our learned bodies. Madame Céline Savage, you remember, in the presence of the committee, in Paris, was placed in somnambulism. Even while insensible to stimuli she formed, it is recorded, a correct judgment of the diseases of persons around her, especially in the person of M. Mark, one of the committee, and in that of a young lady, on whom M. Dupuytren had operated for dropsy, and had tried the effects of the milk of a goat which had been anointed with mercury. Madame, unconscious of this, prescribed the very same remedy. You remember the report, Evelyn. Ev. I remember, but believe it not. Cast. And is it thus with all our legends? Have you no more faith in your own order? There is the learned physician, Justin Kerner. You have not forgotten, Astrophel, his beautiful story of that most accomplished somnambule, the prophetess of Provorst, who seemed, as she said, to draw from the air a living principle, and whose very vitality, it was believed, was preserved by the magnetic influence. The body of this ethereal creature enfolded her spirit like a veil of film, she was a very flower of light living on sunbeams. Her senses were lighted up by the minutest atom. A web of gossamer stung her waxen skin like a nettle. At the pale green light of a glowworm, she fell into ecstatic sleep, and then, as to my own Tasso, came to her spectral visitants, with whom she conversed, and whose colorless forms were visible even to her earthly companions. This fair creature had, as the story goes, been some time dead, when her mother made passes over her cold face and lips, and lo! Her eyes opened, and a tremor was on her lip. Were I Astrophel, methinks I would make a pilgrimage to Lowenstein, where her body lies. And now, Evelyn, if you will, reprove me for my wildness, but confess there must be a sort of truth in legends so circumstantial as these. Ev. A fair question, dearest Castelli. Yes, it is the crude or false interpretation of that sort of truth, a transient glimpse it may be, of some embryo principle, that leads to popular error. A baseless theory is raised on an isolated fact. An infantile science, bursting from its leading strings ere it can crawl, topples headlong down the precipice, and splits on the rock of hypothetical presumption. And then the confusion into which the mind is thrown by the definitions and conclusions of magnetizers, would make a very babel of the fair field of philosophy. The least perplexing, perhaps, is that of the French savants who referred magnetism to the efforts of a fluid matter consisting of fire, air, and spirit, to preserve its equilibrium in certain bodies which were, as to their capacity for this fluid, in a state of plus and minus. There is nothing very unphilosophical in this. For the essence of magnetism is somewhat analogous to eccentric derangement of mind, a disturbance of that order or symmetry among the faculties and actions, by which one is highly excited and another is comparatively passive. In a word, mesmerism is true in part, it may induce catalepsy, somnambulism, exalted sensation, apathetic insensibility, suspended circulation, even death. Clairvoyance and prophecy alone are the impositions as regards its effects, as the blue flame at the fingertips is of its nature. One folly more. Mesmer himself vaunted to Dr. von Elicken, 20 years ago I magnetized the sun, and so that the miracle of Joshua was but a stroke of magnetism. Indeed, Richter, rector of the school of Dessau, affirms that all the miracles of the Testament were but the sequences of magnetic passes. And Kieser refers all to a telluric spirit, a sort of magic, of which the sun and moon are the grand reservoirs, nay, this influence is the real cause of sleep and waking. Ida. So that we are mesmerized by the moon at nightfall, and unmesmerized by the sun at the opening of the dawn. Ev. Then there were some aphorisms of Wolfart about fiddling to the viscera with his magnetic medicine, and working them up, as it were, to a jig or a bolero. These are the visions of a madman. But surely the illusion regarding this mysterious fluid is confessed in Depotit's own notion of his own wondrous faculty, when he asserts his belief that animal magnetism is analogous to the royal touch, and the mysteries of Apollo, and Aesculapius, and Isis, the miracles of Vespasian, and the Sibylline prophecies. Astra. You sneer at this as you did at the blue flame, but Depotit assures us that while he is magnetizing his patients, he feels a sensation at the points of his fingers resembling the aura from diffused electricity. Now is it not fair to ask if electromagnetism may not reside in the animal as well as in the mineral, in man as well as in the torpedo and gymnotus? And why may there not be a condition of intercommunication or en rapport, a magnetic aura creeping through the nerves of each body? We should not, therefore, make any hasty decision against the presence of an aura streaming from the fingers and directed by the will. Monsieur Deleuze said, in Paris, I do not know if this be material or spiritual, nor to what distance it is impelled, but it is impelled and directed by my will, for if I cease to will, the influence instantly ceases. I remember Priestley opined that phlogiston in our bodies produced electricity, which was destined for our own purposes merely. But as the Silurus and the torpedo possess the power of imparting theirs, although at the expense of their animal power, I presume to think that concentrated mind may impart our own nervous influence to others. Ev. I admire the acuteness of your question, Astrophel, but you are now come down from your clouds, you are descending unawares to physiology. There are, doubtless, many peculiar states of the nervous system at present inexplicable. I grant it is possible that the influence of the nervous energy may become so eccentric as to illustrate the phenomena of magnetism, if, as some believe, this influence depends on a subtle fluid analogous to light, heat, and electricity. The nerve conveying this fluid as the wire conducts the electric. Thus an influence, which is apparently physical, may be, in reality, mental, for there is usually consciousness of the contact. M. Bertrand believed that the mind alone of the patient was acted on, and this is strengthened by the experiments of the Abbé Faria, who produced many of these phenomena by merely exclaiming to his sensitive visitors, Dormes. Astra. Well, you are drawing the influences of mind and body very closely together, Evelyn. If animal magnetism be not the universal influence of sensitive beings, what is personal sympathy? Ev. It is not that mysterious freemasonry of the senses which may impart a superhuman knowledge, or confer a power of personal recognition. Yet we are required to believe such stories. Astra. And are there not many well attested? There was a Monsieur de la Tour Landry, a nobleman of France, who so powerfully influenced a young shoemaker by whom he was measured, that the youth fell into a senseless syncope, and profuse hemorrhage succeeded it. This influence was repeated, and excited so deep an interest in the mind of the noble, that he instituted an inquiry regarding his birth and fortunes. And the result was, that Monsieur de la Tour discovered in the humble mechanic the son of his sister, the Baronne de Vezins. The thrill of feeling with which the lover touches the lip of his mistress, the intense delight with which the mother presses her infant to her bosom, are illustrations of that power to which I allude. It is the magnetic touch of beauty which sends the fires of passion not only through the bounding heart of youth, but even through the icy veins of the Stoic. He that would preserve the liberty of his soul, said Socrates, must abstain from kissing handsome people. What, then, said Charmides, must I be afraid of coming near a handsome woman? Nevertheless, I remember very well, and I believe you do so too, Socrates, that being one day in company with Critobulus' beautiful sister, who resembles him so much, as we were searching together for a passage in some author. You held your head close to that beautiful virgin, and I thought you seemed to take pleasure in touching her naked shoulder with yours. Good God, replied Socrates, I will tell you truly how I was punished for it for 5 days after. I thought I felt in my shoulder a certain tickling pain as if I had been bit by gnats or pricked with nettles. And I must confess, too, that during all that time I felt a certain hitherto unknown pain at my heart. Ev. So that, the crime, like that of Sir Peter Teazle, carried its punishment along with it. But you must see that the mind of Socrates first appreciated beauty, ere this influence was imparted to him. Imagination is not certainly idle here, yet I grant, that if the charm of substantial beauty or endearment be wanting, poesy will ever be but a cold and joyless sentiment. Astra. Then there is another mysterious sympathy, the fascination of the evil eye, or fascino. There were, both in Africa and in Illyria, writes Aulus Gellius, certain families believed to possess the power of destroying trees, flowers, and children, and this by merely praising them. And Plutarch and Pindar refer to the credence of the Greeks on this point, who were wont to invoke the fate nemesis against this fascination of an evil eye. I think, too, traces of this credence may be found in Ovid, and Horace, and Pliny. Ev. Yes, and in modern Italy the professors of the art are yet termed getatori, or eye-throwers. But Valletta, an Italian author, conscious of the truth, boldly disclaims for his countrymen the notion of demoniac influence, referring it to physical impression, somewhat resembling the fascination of the eye of the rattlesnake, that drops, as we are told, the bird from the branch into its mouth. In that exquisite sympathy between mind and body, the sequence of an influence on sensibility, or on the senses, consists the secret of all this. You remember the effects of intense impression on the mind in the excitement of catalepsy, and indeed in causing instantaneous death, this is intense influence on the sensibility. The effects of deep impression on the sight or touch, by the passes of magnetism, are magnetic ecstasies, this is intense influence on the senses. So that all your mysteries are the result of this influence passing through the brain to the body. And the vaunted miracles of Mesmer, and Bertrand, and Depotet, are, as I have said, impositions, chiefly as regards the nature of their influence. And, like these, the doctrines of Flood the Seeker, of the Abbé Nollet, of Lavater, of Nicetas the Jesuit, and the quaint ideas of many other visionaries, which you may read in their writings, are really explicable by the laws of physiology. When the magnetiseur asserts that a patient should possess a disposition to be acted on, he unwarily divulges his own secret, for this is nothing more than blind faith in a promise. And this credulity is most characteristic of that disordered condition of a nerve, acute sensibility, in which the slightest causes may affect a seeming wonder. Nay, even disease and death were so induced during the manipulations of Hensler and Emmelin. This also is the secret of that influence imparted by the touch of a seventh son, or of the hand of a criminal hanging on the gallows. Or the revolting precept of Pliny, that an epileptic should drink the blood of a dying gladiator, as it gushes from his wound, or the stroking of Valentine Greatrex, the sympathetic powder of Sir Kenelm Digby, the tractors of Perkins. Of chiromancy, rhabdomancy, and of other curiosities recorded in tracts and journals. In my professional life, I have seen the same influence, though infinitely less in degree, imparted by an implicit confidence in the blessings of our science. Even Bertrand honestly confesses its power. A lady was thrown into deep sleep by the touch of a magnet, sent by him in an handkerchief from the distance of 300 miles. But the same effect was produced by the contact of unmagnetized cambric, and Bertrand allows, that where an ignorance of his intention existed, even the magnetized talisman was powerless over his patient. I could tell you tales of bits of wood affecting all the wonders of the metallic tractors of Perkins, and cubes of lead, and those of nickel, fraught, as a learned doctor had declared, with magnetic virtues, but I spare you. From this superstitious faith spring also the miracles of that pious saint, who had assumed the staff of Saint Francis Xavier, the Prince Hohenlohe. One of these was the cure of Miss O'Connor, attested by Dr. Baddeley, of Chelmsford, who had tried in vain to relieve the lady of acute neuralgia. She was directed to prostrate herself at the altar in Chelmsford at the moment, and the sainted prince would kneel at his shrine in the cathedral of Bamberg. At the appointed time, during the solemn celebration of High Mass, as she exclaimed, "Thy will be done, O Lord," the agonizing limb was painless. I do not doubt the possibility of such an incident. And here is the unfolding of another secret of these German magnetizers, who were believed to shoot at their patients with the unerring aim of a rifle, even though many miles might intervene. Nadler, as we are told in the Asclepian, was so good a shot, that he brought a woman to the ground at the moment he fixed his magnetic aura at her, aiming between the eyes and the bosom, even at the distance of 18 miles. I am aware that this, my philosophy, would not pass current at the Vatican, for the Congregation of the Holy Office, having once applied to the Pope, to know if animal magnetism were lawful, and if penitents might be permitted to be operated on. His Holiness replied, that the application of principles and means purely physical to things and effects which are supernatural, for the purpose of explaining them physically, is nothing but an unlawful and heretical deception. But I may tell you that His Holiness himself was once a great monopolist of saints' cures, if we may believe a book, printed by Roberts, in London, in 1605, entitled, A Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostures. To withdraw the hearts of religious men, under pretence of casting out devils. Practiced by Father Edmonds, alias Weston, a Jesuit, and divers Romish priests his wicked associates. And, moreover, the interference of priests has often led to the interdiction of Protestants, in their scientific ministering to disease the most severe, as typhus fever, or surgical operations, because they were heretics. While the profane Paracelsus says, it matters not, by God or devil, so he be cured, even without an indulgence, I presume, from Della Genga, or the leave of the Sacred College. Believe me, the influence of faith will illustrate all this mystery, and reduce even these impostures to a simple truth. Without it, only the grossest superstition would believe that sympathy would thus take the wings of the morning, and impart to a mind that was thinking at our antipodes the consciousness of our own sentiments. For this would be a revival of that blind credulity, which in the darker ages was reposed in the superhuman agency of magic and of witchcraft. Sibylline Influence. She was a charmer, and cooed almost red. The thoughts of people. Othello. Ida. As you unfold the wonders of the mind, Evelyn, the secrets of many splendid mysteries shine forth in the light of your truth. And the wisdom of charmed rings, blessed brambles, and amulets and talismans, fades before the precepts of a purer faith. Yet is there no witchcraft in your philosophy? You have, methinks, absolved Astrophel from spells and dark hours, for, in the softened luster of his eye I see a light more holy than its wonted flash of divination. Cast. You have more faith in his conversion than I have, Ida, for, lo ye now. On a mossy stone in Tintern lay this sable velvet pouch, which, from its mystic broidery, might be the lost treasure of a Rosicrucian Kabbalist. There's magic in the web of it. A Sibyl that had numbered in the world. The sun to make 200 compasses. In her prophetic fury sowed the work. And here is a scroll of vellum folded within it. Listen, and you shall hear the pencilings of some unhappy student, benighted in the mazes of the Kabbalah. The eye of modern philosophy may wink at the wisdom of occult sciences, and sorcerers and magicians, necromancers and Rosicrucians, Kabbalists and conjurers, astrologers and soothsayers, philomaths, drows, and Oreads, wizards and witches. And warlocks, and sibyls and gypsies, may be, in its estimation, a mere legion of ciphers. Yet faith hath been long and firmly lavished on the art of divination by the learned and mighty men of all ages. The Chaldean, who read the stars, was the Coryphaeus and the type of superhuman knowledge. The Magi of Persia and Egypt, and other Orient lands, followed in his wake. The venerable Hermes Trismegistus was surrounded by his proselytes in the year of the world 2076. And Apollonius and Zoroaster, and Pythagoras, and, in later ages, John of Leyden, Roger Bacon, and other learned mystagogues, have imbibed a more than mortal wisdom from the aspect of those starry lights which gem the vaulted firmament. While the luminous schools of Padua, and Seville, and Salamanca, were rich in the records of occult and mystic learning. Emperors and kings, and ministers, who ruled the destiny of mighty nations, have believed. Wallenstein was all-confiding. Richelieu and Mazarin, as Morin writes, retained soothsayers as a part of their household. Napoleon studied with implicit faith his book of fate, and Canute, obedient to his confidence in the virtue of relics, directed his Roman agent to buy St. Augustine's arms for 100 silver talents, and one of gold. Nay, what saith divinity itself? Glanville, the chaplain of King Charles II, affirms in his Saggissimus Triumphatus, that the disbeliever in a witch must believe the devil gratis. And Wesley said, that giving up witchcraft was, in fact, giving up the Bible. Now, as the Chaldean Sophs were divided into 3 classes, 1, the Askaphim, or charmer, 2, the Temekaskaphim, or magician, 3, the Chazdim, or astrologer. So the legion of modern witches was composed of a mystic triad, distinguished by colors that were a symbol of their influence on our mortal frame. The black witch could hurt, but not help, the white could help, but not hurt. The gray could both help and hurt. Ida. My own Castaly, have pity on us. Evelyn may unroll the coils of this unholy manuscript if he will. I do believe this lettered clerk has, in some unhappy hour, wandered by the ruins of the 7 churches in the valley of Glendalough, and there, creeping up to St. Kevin's bed, that hangs over the gloomy waters of its lake, has won the fatal gift of Catholic magic. Or perchance he has sworn allegiance with Faust and Friar Bacon. Astra. If an Oxford student must kneel at the shrine of a fair lady, he will whisper this confession. In exploring the treasures of black-letter romance, he reveled among the occult mysteries, slighting that pure analysis of nature which is the essence of all philosophy. The legends of Reginald Scott, Defoe, Glanville, and Wanley, were the companions of his pillow. And thus in poring over the legends of enchantment, he was himself enchanted, and contemplated a wondrous history of witchcraft, where Sir Walter himself had failed. Let me have light penance, and I promise in the simple and beautiful light of nature alone to read her wonders, and if I dare, to study astrology in those planet eyes which look so mildly on their proselyte. Ida. Or rather, as the Magi of old, you will burn your books of divination, and, like Friar Bacon, who broke the rare glass which showed him things 50 miles off, you will study divinity, and become a pious anchorite. Cast. I am happy that you abandon the dark and dooming spells of the Magus and the witch, Astrophel, for witchcraft is the unholy opposition of a demon to the deity. Yet in your fate I read my own. But censure not the poetry of that innocent romance that lights up the legends of the berry-brown Sibyl, whether she be a Tirana prowling in the streets of Madrid, or a gypsy perched upon the heath brow of Norwood, for theirs are happy prophecies. Yet if, like Astrophel, I am to be the slave of philosophy, let me at least make a dying in a swan-like end. It was among the heath valleys, where nature lay in wild repose around the place of my birth, that I first met the glance of a gypsy's eye. On the northern side of that beautiful sandhill in Surrey, that rears its purple and turret-crowned crest between the chalk hills and the Weald, there is a green and bosky glen, the Valley Lonesome, along the waste of Broadmoor. That spreads between the brow of Leith Hill and the Roman camp of Anstiebury, comes rippling down the crystal streamlet of the Till, which, blending with a torrent that leaps from a lofty sandrock, steals away amid mosses and cardamines. And cuckoo flowers. Now gliding between its emerald banks, now swelling into a broader sheet, beneath the beech woods of Wotton, the ancient seat of the Evelyns. There the willows dip their silver blossoms, and the violet, almost hidden beneath them, fills the air with sweetness. There the wild briar wreaths in light festoons its tiny roses, and the passion flower, entwining its luxuriant tendrils around the aspen and the sycamore, hangs its beautiful blue stars in rich profusion. And there, among the boughs of lofty elms whose shadows in the early morning darken the casements of Tillingbourne, a colony of rooks hang their woody nests. And the murmurs of the ringdove, nestling within the woods of Wotton in the rookery, are heard in the golden noon and sunset of June, floating around this leafy paradise. It was on such an eve that my thoughts had faded into slumber. And when my eyelids oped, there was a form of embrowned beauty before me so wild, yet so majestic, that Cleopatra, in the garb of an Egyptian slave girl, might have stolen upon my sleep, so scant of clothing, so lovely of form and feature. She was like an almond flower upon a leafless branch. Her expression was full of beautiful contrasts, for, while her eaglet eye went into my being, there was a languid smile on her ruddy lip, as she were about to syllable my own destiny. And, indeed, she did unfold to me many things which have been most strangely worked out and verified in my life. I wept at some of these foretellings, and she said, tears were the pearls that gem the rose leaves of life. I smiled at others, and she said, smiles were the sunlight that warmed their swelling leaflets into beauty. Throughout that summer night, when all were sleeping, save two romantic girls, she unfolded to me the secrets of her tribe, and a mine of mysteries learned from a Bohemian Maghrebi. She told me how, and why, the Druids, when the moon was 6 days old, cut the mistletoe with a golden knife, how the vervain was gathered with the left hand, at the rising of the dog star, and the lunaria was valueless, if not picked by moonlight. How the rowan wood, and the banyan seedling, and the four-leaved shamrock, bore a charm in their tender leaves against every ill of life. In nature, she said, there is no bane without its antidote, were the intellect of man ripe for its discovery. There are corals and green jaspers, carved into the forms of dragons and lizards, hung round an infant's neck, for the cure of an ague, the crimson-spotted heliotropium, to staunch a flow of blood. A wrapper of scarlet cloth, to mitigate the virulence of smallpox, the blue flannel, 9 times dyed, to allay the pains of rheumatism, and the magic word abracadabra, to soothe the disorders of a nerve. And, above all, that wondrous weapon salve of sympathy, which once healed on the instant the wound of Ulysses, and that which the dainty Ariel gave to Miranda, to charm Hippolito to life and health. And that with which the Lady of Branxholme salved the broken lance, when William of Deloraine was healed. It will be long ere from my memory fade this vision of Charlotte Stanley. In pity, Evelyn, leave me this one romance of my young life, the sheet and taper, nay, the ducking stool for the witch, if you will, but deign to bestow one smile upon the gypsies. Remember the story of the Sibylline tables. If Sextus Tarquin had not frowned on the Roman gypsy, she had not burned 6 of those precious volumes, which, from the massive cabinets of stone made to enclose the 3 that were preserved, prove that the Roman thought them priceless. One smile, Evelyn, for my Sibyl. Ev. Not in memory of the Sibylline tables, but for your own sake, dear Castaly. Although the innocence of your nut-brown Sibyl is not so clear, and I am somewhat jealous, too, of that white magic of hers, which hath won the belief of so many minds the reverse of illiterate, who, from the Chaldean even to Bacon and William Lilly, have spurned philosophy, and even divinity, and pinned their faith upon a gypsy's sleeve, and doted on the inspiration of an astrologer. Ida. Forgetful, it would seem, that the wicked king of Babylon found the devout Daniel, and Hananiah, and Michael, and Azariah, 10 times better than all his magi and astrologers. These are the antiquaries who possessed the last relic of the true cross, or the last morsel of Shakespeare's mulberry, of which last bit there may be about 10,000. Such are they who would pen learned theses on the disputed place of sepulture of Saint Denis, and determine the question, too, although one of his heads is in the cathedral of Bamberg, another in the church of Saint Vitus in the castle of Prague. One of his hands in a chapel at Munich, one of his bodies, minus one hand, in the keeping of the monks of Saint Emmeram at Regensburg. While the monks of Saint Denis possess another, his head being preserved in the 3rd shrine of the treasury in their cathedral. These may be innocent follies, but superstition, alas, will not always stop here. Fanaticism soon descends to self-infliction, or to cruelty, and in that moment it becomes a black stain on the heart of man. Yet, even for the tortures of the Inquisition, so exquisite, that we might believe them the suggestions of a devil, the Jesuit, Macedo, has put forth this profane justification, that the bloody tribunal was first instituted by the deity in the condemnation of Cain and the bricklayers of Babel. Ev. Such was the trial of ordeal instituted for the test of innocence. Among the Anglo-Saxons, as all the chronicles of their history will show, this mode of trial prevailed, as in the ordeals of the cross, of boiling water and of the hot iron, of cold water, or drowning, and of the coarsened, or consecrated cake. Equally savage was the trial for murder, so prevalent in Scotland, especially the institution of their bar recht, or right of the bier. Among the decisions of Lord Fountainhall, you may read of legends almost incredible. Philip, the son of Sir James Stanfield, was executed because, in lifting the corpse of his murdered father from its bier, blood welled forth from his wound. And the Laird of Auchindrane was tortured, because a corpse chanced to bleed on the approach of a little girl, who, I believe, was merely one of his domestics. But waiving these profanations, the relics of a darker age, let me have a word with Astrophel on parting. The seeming fulfillment of many a Sibylline prophecy is perfectly clear as to its source. There may be coincidence, as in the dream. Or faith and inducement may impart an energy of action, which may itself work a wonder, or accomplish that end which is referred to a special power. At the siege of Breda, in 1625, when fatigue and abstinence had well nigh reduced the garrison to prostration and despair, the Prince of Orange practiced this pious fraud on his soldiers. He pretended to have obtained a charmed liquor, so concentrated, that, on the principles of homeopathy, 4 drops would saturate a gallon of water with restorative virtues. And with so much skill was this administered by the physicians, that a general restoration was speedily effected. You remember, Astrophel, the temptation of Diocletian. From Flavius Vopiscus we learn, that he was paying the Druidess of Brabant, with whom he lodged. When I am emperor, he said, I will be more generous. Nay, said the Druidess, you shall be emperor, when you have killed the boar. He hunted and killed boars incessantly, but the purple was not offered to him. At length, the Emperor Nemirianus was murdered by Arius Aper. This was the eventful moment, and, transfixing the heart of Aper with his sword, he said, I have slain the boar, and the imperial crown was his. Is not this, too, the counterpart of that seeming prophecy of the weird sisters, which made Macbeth a murderer and a king? There was an enchanted stone at Scone, in Scotland, the Palladium of Scottish liberty, for it was believed that the lord of that spot on which the stone lay, should bear sovereign sway. King Edward bore this talisman away in triumph. And Scotland, depressed by its loss, became a vassal of the English crown. And this faith may invest the merest trifle with a spell. Sir Matthew Hale was presiding in his court on the trial of a witch. She had cured many diseases by a charm in her possession, and the evidence seemed conclusive of her guilt. But when the judge himself looked on this charm, behold! It was a scrap of paper, inscribed with a Latin sentence, which, in default of money, he himself, while on the circuit, had given many years before, in a merry mood, to mine host, by way of reckoning. Among the many analogies to this story in ancient times, there was the potent poison charm or antidote of Mithridates, king of Pontus. Its effect was supreme. And what its composition? 20 leaves of rue, 1 grain of salt, 2 nuts, and 2 dried figs. Now you will remember that the wizard and the ministers of these charms, even among savages, were also their physicians, and, among pagans and papists, their priests. It is clear that the sensitiveness of mind and body under disease, when the first were consulted, and under the influence of superstitious fear, instilled by the priesthood, rendered them impressible to the most trifling causes. Even in minds of superior natural energy, from the instilment of superstitious ideas in infancy, a blind faith will often become paramount. Such a mind, and so influenced, was Byron's. And on such a faith he once stole an agate bead from a lady, who had told him it was an antidote to love. It failed. Had it not, Byron might have been a happier man. But the world would have been reft of poesy, the brightest, yet the darkest, that ever flashed on the heart and mind of man. Sir Humphrey Davy, you may recollect, knew a man of very high dignity, who never went out shooting without a bittern's claw fastened to his buttonhole by a riband, which he thought ensured him good luck. To illustrate the innocence of your gypsy, Castaly, hear this story. About 40 years ago, a young lady, afterwards Mrs. W., rallied her companions aloud for listening to the predictions of an itinerant gypsy, when the latter malignantly threatened her to beware of her first confinement. She was shortly afterwards married. And, as the period of her peril approached, it became evident to her friends that the remembrance of the wizard malediction began to fasten upon her spirits. She survived her time only a few days, and the medical attendants, who were men of eminence, stated it as their opinion, that mental prepossession alone could be admitted as the cause of her death. Not one unfavorable circumstance having occurred to explain it. And some melancholy illusion of this nature induced fatality in the case of another lady, Mrs. S., who, according to the statement of the venerable Mr. Klein, reluctantly submitted to the removal of a small tumor in her breast. Unexpectedly, and without any apparent cause, she died, on the morning following the operation. It was then for the first time ascertained that she had prognosticated her death, and the impression that she should not survive had taken so strong a possession of her mind, that her minutest household arrangements were preconcerted. As appeared by the papers found in her cabinet. I believe that many modern instances of gradual and almost imperceptible decay, may be referred to the influence both of melancholy prophecies and visions on the mind, although their agency may be unsuspected. And as obscure as that of the poisonous herbs of the Thessalian Eryctho, or the sorceress of Neapolis, or the aqua tofana of the Italians. And superstitious fear may induce a sudden death. Alfred, a nobleman, was one of the conspirators against the Saxon Athelstan. To justify himself from the accusation, he went to Rome, that he might make oath of his innocence before John, the Pope. On the instant he took the oath he was convulsed, and, in 3 days, died. Then as to the language of the stars, as the phrenologist is much indebted to the principles of Lavater in forming his estimate of character, so I believe of the astrologer. The aspect of the face is not always disregarded in his prophecy, while he seems to observe only the aspect of the stars. And although there is often a very strange precision in his guesses, yet there was once a curious incident in my own presence, from which we may learn something of this secret. On a visit to a learned astrologer, who might rest his fame on another art in which he is so eminent, our fortunes, past and future, were told with extreme minuteness, and, I confess, with many coincidences of former times. One was reminded by the seer of a state of deprivation which he endured in the year 18, in the Mediterranean. The officer remembered in that year being becalmed in a voyage to Malta, and, under a sultry sky with parching thirst, enduring the want of water for many days. This was conclusive of the fidelity of the planets, until we discovered that the horoscope was imperfect, for the officer had given to the astrologer the wrong date of his birth. Cast. And this, sir, is your philosophy of mystery? Oh, for the forethought of my Sibyl, that I might learn my own fate for listening to this treason against the throne of fancy, on the steps of which I have so long offered up my homage, this ruthless spoliation of her dreamy kingdom. Ev. Let me for once play the Sibyl, fair Castaly, and whisper the penalty in your ear. Ida. A lesson in natural philosophy, and the apt scholar, as I read it on her cheek, has in a moment learned it all by heart. O'ershadowing all her bright visions of earth and its romances. Ev. What marvel that a daughter of earth should be so apt in its philosophy? For half her thoughts were of its sun, and half were of its shoress. But it is not so easy to shake the throne of fancy, or to lay the genius of romance. He will ever wave his wand of enchantment over the human mind. The poet will still build his air castles, and the ghost-seer indulge in his wild visions of nonentity. The wonders of creation will still affect us, according to the quality of intellect or genius, or the constitution or cultivation of the mind. The poor Indian will still see God in clouds, and hear him in the wind, and the untutored rustic be startled by the shadow of a shade. To him the slightest change in the regular course of nature will still be a special miracle: thunder, the awful voice of divine reproof; lightning, the flashes of divine displeasure. The scintillations of the aurora, the spectral forms of contending armies, and the comet foretell the wreck of mighty empires. Against this untutored devotion I would not breathe a thought. It is the voice of the deity speaking to the savage. But it is the privilege, the duty of intellect, to think more deeply of the physiology of nature, and to learn from the physical sciences, its real utility in the grand scheme of the creation. Philosophy, rising from the sublime study of these beautiful phenomena, regards them as the pure effect of those elemental laws, by which the integrity of the universe is preserved. And what ought this philosophy to teach us? Not the superstition of the bigot, for the age of special miracles is, for the present, past, not the pride of the fatalist, who refers all to chance and necessity. Not the mania of the astrologer, who plumes himself on his prophetic wisdom, and presumes to interpret to the letter the mysterious voice of his Creator. But that true wisdom, which threw over Boyle, and Locke, and Newton, the mantle of humility and devotion. The autumn floods had descended from the mountains of Gwent, the banks of the meandering Wye were desolate, and her woods leafless. Yet the Abbey of Tintern was still majestic and unchanged. It had been decided, that when the summer sun shone again on Wyncliffe, the wanderers should revisit the beautiful valleys that lay beneath it, in memory of happy hours. But ere this was fulfilled, changes manifold had come over their destiny, from which might be fashioned a true love story. For Astrophel, Ida had unconsciously worked a spell of natural witchcraft, and his wild thoughts were ever chastened by the pure light of her devotion. And Evelyn almost confessed to Castaly, that there might be a sort of animal magnetism. He has neglected the study of the atomic theory, for the contemplation of the animated atoms that play around his domestic hearth. And the heart and life of Castaly, a poetry in themselves, have since interwoven many a blushing flower on the classic pages of his philosophy. The End.